Pisces, I want to tell you something about being looked at that way, because it's not as simple a compliment as it sounds, and you deserve the full truth of it rather than just the flattering part. Being looked at like you came from heaven feels wonderful. I'm not going to pretend otherwise. There's nothing quite like being someone's answer to a question they didn't even know they were asking, being seen as luminous, as rare, as something close to miraculous. But I want to be honest with you about what that look actually is in its earliest form, because understanding it correctly is the entire difference between this becoming something real and this becoming something that eventually disappoints both of you. In its earliest form, that look isn't quite about you yet. Not fully. It's about an image of you, the best possible version, glimpsed in flashes, still mostly unfinished in their mind, filled in with hope and imagination in all the places where they haven't yet gotten to know the real, complete, occasionally ordinary person underneath the glow. I want to describe what makes this particular kind of early idealization feels so different from ordinary attraction, because I think naming the difference helps you hold it correctly. Ordinary attraction notices things, appearance, humor, some specific quality that catches attention. This goes further than that. When someone looks at you like you came from heaven, they've started to attach something almost mythic to you, a sense that you represent something larger than yourself, some answer to a longing they've been carrying for longer than they've known you existed. That's a heavier thing to be handed, even though it's flattering and it's worth understanding clearly rather than simply enjoying without examination. I want you to hear that without panic, because it's not bad news, it's simply accurate news. And accurate news is what lets something built on it actually last. The falling is real. The intensity is real. What's still forming is whether it's you they're falling for or an early impression of you they haven't yet had the chance to fully test against reality. I want to explain why I'm choosing to give you this fuller, more complicated truth rather than simply celebrating the intensity of the title with you. Because most readings built around a hook like this one skip straight past the part that actually matters. It feels good to hear that someone thinks you're extraordinary. It feels considerably better, longer term, to understand exactly what kind of extraordinary they mean and what needs to happen for that feeling to survive contact with the ordinary reality of who you actually are. Let me show you exactly where this stands and exactly where it's going. Let me turn the first card. There, immediately. That's the exact quality in how they're looking at you right now. This is the figure kneeling at the edge of a pool beneath an open night sky filled with stars, pouring water from 2 jugs, completely unguarded, luminous in a way that draws the eye toward her without her doing anything to demand it. This is what they're actually seeing when they look at you. Not manufactured admiration, not a performance you're putting on to attract this reaction, genuine luminosity, the kind that exists in a person regardless of whether anyone happens to be watching. I want to be clear about this, because I don't want you thinking any part of this reaction was engineered by you trying too hard. It wasn't. This card describes someone who simply is what she is, openly, without armor, and that openness is precisely what reads as otherworldly to someone encountering it for the first time. I want to describe why this specific quality gets interpreted as heavenly, because it's worth understanding the mechanism rather than just accepting the flattery at face value. Most people move through the world with some layer of guardedness, some careful management of how much they let show at any given moment. When someone encounters a person who doesn't do that, who's simply fully present, unguarded, warm, without calculation, it registers as extraordinary, almost impossible, because it's genuinely rare. That rarity is what's producing the reaction, not a performance. The actual, uncommon experience of encountering someone real. I want to point out the 2 jugs in this card too. because they're doing more work than they first appear to. One pours onto solid ground, the other into a pool of water, nourishing both the stable and the still-forming parts of a life at the same time, without favoring one over the other. That balance is exactly what they're sensing in you, even if they couldn't name it directly. Someone who's grounded enough to stay steady and still open enough to feel things fully, that combination is rare, and it's precisely what reads as luminous to someone encountering it for the first time. I also want to describe the single large star directly above her, surrounded by 7 smaller ones. That configuration matters here specifically because it tells me this isn't a single, isolated moment of impression. There have already been several smaller confirmations, one after another, that built up to the larger reaction they're having now. This wasn't love at first sight in the dramatic, instant sense. It accumulated quietly through repeated small encounters with the same genuine quality until it finally crystallized into the intensity described in this title. Let me turn the next card because I want to know exactly what's happening in their imagination right now alongside the real thing they've actually witnessed. There it is. And I need to be honest about this one because it's the part of the reading that requires the most care. This is the moon rising over 2 towers, a winding path leading into darkness between them, a dog and a wolf howling up at it from either side, something unseen moving beneath the surface of the water below. This is the fog, and I want to describe it carefully because it isn't a warning about anything sinister. It's simply the natural, universal condition of early attraction present in every single connection that has ever begun this way, without exception. Alongside the real thing they've witnessed in you, their own imagination has already started filling in gaps, building a fuller picture out of hope, out of longing, out of everything they've wanted to find in another person for longer than they've known you. I want to explain why this matters so much for how the next stretch of time actually unfolds. Right now, some portion of what they're feeling is genuinely, accurately about you. And some portion of it is about a version of you their own mind has constructed, filled in with everything they've been hoping to find. Those 2 portions are currently tangled together, indistinguishable from the outside, both producing exactly the same intensity of feeling. The task ahead for both of you isn't to eliminate the fog entirely. It's to let enough real daylight in that the 2 portions gradually separate until what remains is love for the actual person rather than love for an early impression. I want to describe the creature emerging from the water beneath this card's surface because it's an unusual detail worth taking seriously rather than skipping past as decoration. Something is stirring down there, forming shape gradually, not yet fully visible from where either of you is standing. That's an accurate description of the parts of yourself you haven't fully shown them yet. Not secrets, not anything alarming, simply the ordinary, complex, still unrevealed dimensions of a real person that no early encounter, however intense, could possibly capture all at once. I also want to point out the winding path running between the 2 towers in this image, disappearing into darkness in the distance. That path is real, and it does lead somewhere. Even though neither of you can see the destination clearly from this early point, fog doesn't mean there's no path forward. It simply means the path hasn't been fully illuminated yet, which is exactly the natural condition of any connection young enough to still be running mostly on early impression rather than accumulated. Tested knowledge of each other. Let me turn the next card, because I want to know how much of what they're feeling is already genuinely, solidly about you there. And I'm relieved to see this one because it answers the question honestly. This is a single hand extending from a cloud, holding a golden chalice overflowing with water. 5 distinct streams pouring from the rim, a small dove descending toward it, with something delicate held in its beak. This is real feeling, and I want to be specific about how much of it is genuinely, solidly yours already, because I don't want you thinking this entire reading is a caution against trusting any of it. The overflow in this card is substantial, real, not manufactured out of fantasy alone. Something true and significant has already been triggered in them by encountering you specifically, not by an idea of you they've projected from nothing. I want to describe the dove in this image because it carries a specific meaning worth naming directly. It's bringing something small and delicate down into the overflow, adding to it rather than taking anything away. That detail tells me the genuine portion of what they're feeling isn't going to shrink as they get to know you more fully. If anything, it's going to keep gaining small, specific additions, particular things about you they discover and fall for individually, one at a time, each one making the real portion of their feeling larger and the foggy, idealized portion correspondingly smaller. I want to point out the 5 distinct streams pouring from this cup because their number matters here specifically. This isn't a single, narrow feeling, a fixation on one particular quality or moment that impressed them. It's broader than that, already touching multiple aspects of who they perceive you to be. That breadth is a good sign. Narrow infatuation tends to be fragile, easily disrupted the moment the one thing it was fixated on turns out to be less perfect than imagined. Broader, multi-stranded feeling is considerably sturdier because it doesn't depend on any single impression holding up perfectly under scrutiny. I also want to describe the calm water beneath this overflowing cup because it tells me something about the emotional register underneath the intensity. Nothing chaotic or unstable about the foundation this feeling is landing on. Even though the surface of it feels dramatic, sudden, almost overwhelming to them, it's settling onto genuinely calm ground, which suggests this isn't going to be the kind of intensity that burns out quickly from its own instability. Let me pull a clarifier, because I want to know exactly who this person actually is underneath the intensity of how they're currently looking at you. There it is. And this tells me something reassuring about their character. This is a king seated on a throne at the edge of the sea, holding a cup in one hand, a scepter in the other, fish and ships visible in the water behind him, calm, emotionally deep, unhurried. This is someone genuinely capable of deep feeling, not someone performing intensity for effect or chasing a temporary thrill before losing interest once the initial glow wears off. I want to describe why this matters so much for the trajectory of this connection, because it's the difference between someone who's going to stay through the fog clearing and someone who was only ever interested in the fog itself. I want to point out that this king is seated at the edge of the sea rather than avoiding it, comfortable with emotional depth rather than frightened of it. That comfort matters enormously. Some people, once the idealized fog starts to clear and they begin seeing the real, complete, occasionally ordinary version of someone, panic and retreat because they were only ever interested in maintaining the fantasy. This card is telling me that isn't what you're dealing with here. This is someone who can actually hold real feeling once it becomes real, rather than someone who needs the illusion intact to stay interested. I want to describe the fish leaping from the water behind this figure's throne because it's a detail that speaks directly to depth beneath a calm surface. This isn't someone whose emotional life is shallow or purely reactive to the excitement of a new attraction. There's genuine depth underneath the calm exterior, movement and life happening below the surface, even while the outward presentation stays composed and steady. That depth is exactly what allows someone to eventually love the complete, complicated, real version of a person rather than only the smooth, uncomplicated surface of an early impression. I also want to point out the ship visible sailing steadily in the water behind him, undisturbed by the turbulence sometimes shown elsewhere in this card's imagery. That steadiness suggests someone capable of navigating whatever emotional weather comes with actually getting to know a real person, rather than someone who needs perfectly calm conditions at all times to stay engaged. Real connections have some weather in them eventually. This is someone equipped to sail through it rather than abandon ship the moment it appears. Let me turn the next card, because I want to know what you actually need to do to help this settle into something lasting. And this is exactly the reassurance I wanted to give you here. This is a figure standing in a walled garden, coins arranged around, vines heavy with fruit climbing nearby, a small castle visible in the distance, everything self-sufficient, unhurried, deeply rooted. This is who you actually are underneath the current glow. And I want to be direct about why this card matters so much for this reading specifically. You don't need to perform being heavenly in order to keep this feeling going. You're not going to need to maintain some elevated, careful version of yourself to avoid disappointing them once the fog clears. This card is telling me the real, ordinary, rooted version of you is genuinely substantial enough to hold their attention just as fully as the idealized early impression currently does. I want to describe why this reassurance matters so much, because it's the exact fear sitting quietly underneath a reading like this one. When someone looks at you like you came from heaven, there's a natural worry attached to it. What happens when they see the ordinary parts, the moments you're tired or difficult or simply human rather than luminous. This card is telling you plainly that the ordinary version of you is not a disappointment waiting to happen. It's simply a different, equally compelling facet of exactly the same person they're currently falling for. I want to describe the trained falcon resting on this figure's gloved hand because it's easy to skip past this decoration, and it actually tells you something important about the substance underneath your current glow. That bird is disciplined, cultivated, the product of patient work over time, not wild or accidental. That's an accurate description of everything real about you that this person is currently sensing, even in the early, foggy stages. Your warmth, your presence, your particular way of making people feel at ease, none of that arrived by accident. It was built over time through real living, and it's every bit as substantial as it currently appears, even once the initial idealization fades. I also want to point out the wall surrounding this garden, because it suggests something worth naming clearly. That wall isn't there to keep this person out. It's simply marking the boundary of something genuinely yours, self-sufficient, built and maintained independently of whether anyone happens to be admiring it at any given moment. That self-sufficiency is exactly why you don't need to perform for them in order to keep their interest. What's inside those walls was already complete before they ever arrived to admire it. Let me turn the next card, because I want to know what it actually looks like once they finally see all of you clearly. There it is. And this is exactly the moment I want to describe for you. This is two figures standing face to face, each holding a cup, extending it toward the other at exactly the same height. A winged lion's head hovering above them both. A caduceus rising in the background between two matching houses. This is the actual arrival point, genuine mutual recognition between two complete, real people rather than one person adoring an image while the other quietly worries about living up to it. I want to describe what changes once this happens, because it's a genuine shift rather than simply an intensification of what's already there. Right now, there's an imbalance built into the fog. One person elevated, admired, slightly unreachable, and the other reaching toward that elevation. Once the fog clears, that imbalance resolves. You meet at the same height, equals, both fully visible to each other. I want you to notice again that both cups in this image are being offered, not just one. That mutuality is the whole point of what this reading is building toward. Not you continuing to be adored from a slight distance, admired like something otherworldly. Both of you, fully known, fully seen, choosing each other with complete information rather than an early, partial impression. I want to describe the caduceus rising between the two matching houses in this card's background. because it's an image of healing built directly into an exchange between equals, and it's worth naming what that healing actually accomplishes here. For them, it's the relief of loving something real rather than maintaining an exhausting, unsustainable fantasy that always requires careful management to protect from disappointment. For you, it's the relief of finally being loved completely, rather than carrying the quiet pressure of living up to an idealized image you never fully agreed to represent. I also want to point out the winged lion's head positioned above both figures, watching over this exchange rather than participating directly in it. That presence suggests something protecting the honesty of this meeting once it happens, making sure neither of you slips back into the earlier dynamic of one person elevated and the other reaching. Trust that protection when the moment comes. Let the meeting actually be equal, rather than falling into old patterns out of habit or nervousness. Let me turn the last card, because I want to know what this all becomes once it's fully settled into something real. There it is. And this is exactly the right note to end this reading on. This is a modest house in the distance beneath a rainbow. 2 figures with arms raised underneath it, small children dancing at their feet, a calm river running past in the foreground. This is lasting. Not a brief, intense infatuation that burns brightly and then fades once the initial mystery wears off, but something that settles into the actual architecture of both your lives, extending through time, rather than staying contained to this one intense early stretch. I want to describe why this matters so much given how this whole reading opened, because falling hard can sometimes describe something that crashes just as hard as it rises. This card is telling me the opposite. What's building here has real staying power. I want to point out the modest scale of the house in this image because it's worth naming directly. This isn't a card about a dramatic, cinematic romance that photographs beautifully but exhausts both people trying to sustain the intensity of it indefinitely. It's about something quieter and more durable. Ordinary love, extended across an ordinary life, made significant not by constant intensity but by the fact that it's real all the way through once the fog has fully cleared. I want to describe the children dancing at the feet of the 2 adult figures in this card because they speak to continuation rather than a single contained peak of feeling. Whatever this becomes doesn't stay frozen at the intensity of these early days. It grows, develops, and extends outward into a fuller texture over time, the same way a river keeps flowing calmly past the scene rather than simply stopping the moment one dramatic picture is taken of it. I also want to point out the rainbow itself in this image, because it's specifically the kind of thing that appears only after something has already passed through rain that's already fallen, weather that's already cleared. That's an accurate description of what this connection is going through right now. The intensity, the fog, the early idealization, all of that is the weather this rainbow requires. It isn't a mistake or a phase to regret. It's simply the necessary passage that makes the clear, lasting version on the other side of it possible. Let me pull it together. Here's your reading. Someone is looking at you right now with real, genuine reverence, and a significant portion of what they're feeling is entirely, accurately about you. Your actual warmth, your actual presence, the rare quality of being fully yourself without armor. Alongside that real feeling, there's also fog. The natural, universal fantasy every early connection includes, where some portion of what they feel is about an idealized image, their own imagination has been quietly filling in. There's someone genuinely capable of holding real feeling once it becomes real, not someone who needs the fantasy intact to stay interested. And you don't need to perform being heavenly to keep this going. The rooted, ordinary version of you underneath the current glow is substantial enough to hold their attention just as fully once they actually get to see it. What follows, as the fog clears, is a genuine meeting between equals, both of you fully known rather than one person adoring an image from a careful distance. And what it settles into, finally, is lasting, ordinary, durable love, extended across an ordinary life, made real by surviving the fog rather than needing the fog to stay intact. I want to say the whole shape of this once more, cleanly, before turning to the practical instructions. What's happening to you right now is genuinely rare and genuinely flattering, and none of what follows is meant to diminish that. But the fullest version of this story isn't you staying beautifully unreachable in someone's early impression forever. It's you becoming completely known, completely ordinary in all the small human ways every real person is, and discovering that the feeling doesn't shrink when it meets the whole truth of you. It deepens. Now, the practical part. First, let them see you fully, including the parts that aren't currently part of the glowing image they're holding. There's a temptation when someone looks at you like you came from heaven to try to maintain that impression, to only show them your most polished, most admirable moments. Resist that temptation. The ordinary parts of you are what actually make this last, not what threatens to ruin it. Notice the specific moments where you feel the urge to perform rather than simply be. That urge is worth catching in real time, because every instance you let it win is another delay in the process. This whole reading is describing the slow, necessary transition from being admired to being known. Second, don't panic if you notice the intensity shift or soften slightly as they get to know you better. That softening isn't losing interest. It's the fog clearing, the idealized image gradually being replaced by real, specific knowledge of who you actually are. A slight decrease in the intensity of early infatuation, replaced by a steadier, more grounded warmth, is a sign of health, not a sign of trouble. Third, be patient with the fog rather than rushing to correct it all at once. You don't need to immediately confess every ordinary or difficult thing about yourself in order to prove you're not actually heaven sent. Let the real picture emerge naturally, over time, through ordinary shared experience, rather than forcing a dramatic reveal all at once. Fourth, watch how they respond as the real, complete version of you starts to show through. This reading is telling me they're going to stay genuinely engaged, rather than retreating once the fantasy starts giving way to reality. But it's still worth paying attention, because that response is going to tell you clearly whether this is someone who fell for you specifically or someone who was only ever interested in the idea of you. Look specifically for how they respond to ordinary, unremarkable moments, not the polished ones, the mundane ones. Someone who lights up equally in the boring, everyday stretches is falling for the actual person. Someone whose interest only sparks during the impressive, performed moments may still be somewhere in the fog, and that's worth knowing rather than ignoring. Fifth, let yourself be idolized a little, for now, without guilt about it. There's nothing wrong with enjoying the early glow of being looked at this way, even while you understand it isn't the complete, final picture yet. You don't have to correct it prematurely or downplay it out of excessive caution. Simply enjoy it honestly, while trusting the process of it settling into something more accurate over time. This isn't permission to deceive them or to actively cultivate a false impression. It's simply permission to let a genuinely lovely feeling exist without immediately picking it apart out of anxiety. Enjoy the glow. Just don't mistake it for the entire story. And sixth, the one that matters most. Trust that the real version of you is enough, because this reading is telling you plainly that it is. The fear underneath a situation like this one is often the quiet worry that you're only being loved for an exaggerated, unrealistic version of yourself, and that the real you, once revealed, will disappoint. These cards are directly contradicting that fear. The real you is not a smaller, less impressive consolation prize hiding behind the glowing first impression. It's the actual substance the glowing first impression was pointing toward all along. I want to say a little more about this specific fear, because it runs deeper than most people admit out loud. Somewhere along the way, many people learn to associate being fully known with being found wanting. The idea that if someone really saw everything, all the ordinary and imperfect parts, they'd love you less than they do right now. In this careful, curated, early stage. This reading is telling you that assumption is backwards, at least here, with this particular person. Full knowledge doesn't shrink what they feel. It's the only thing that can actually make it permanent. Okay, small favor. When you notice this shifting, the fog clearing, the connection deepening into something steadier and more grounded, come back and drop the words, the real me, in the comments. Just that, the real me, because that's the actual arrival point this reading has been describing. Not staying forever in the early, intense glow of being adored from a slight distance. Being fully known and staying loved anyway, which is a considerably rarer and more valuable thing than the initial intensity alone. And tell me, if you're willing, what your own worry has been about this, the specific thing you've quietly feared they'd discover about you that might change how they look at you. A lot of you are going to discover that fear was smaller and less significant than it felt once you actually name it out loud rather than letting it sit privately, unspoken, in the back of your mind. There's something worth reading in that kind of comment section beyond simple reassurance. It's a pattern confirmed by hundreds of different people naming hundreds of different private fears that the specific thing everyone worries will be disqualifying almost never actually is. Being seen fully turns out, again and again, to be the thing that deepens love rather than the thing that ends it. If these keep reaching you at the right moment, subscribe, there's more coming. And I want you here for it. So here's where I'll leave you. I keep thinking about the difference between an icon and a person. An icon gets admired from a careful distance, kept slightly unreachable, protected from the ordinary scrutiny that reveals someone to be simply, completely human. A person gets known fully, including the parts that aren't particularly impressive, the moments of tiredness and difficulty and ordinary humanness that never make it into anyone's early, idealized impression of anybody. Right now, you're being looked at a little like an icon. That's real, and it's lovely, and I don't want you to dismiss it or rush past it. But the actual destination this reading is describing isn't staying an icon forever. It's becoming known completely and discovering that being known changes nothing essential about how they feel. If anything, it deepens it, because loving an actual person with real texture and real ordinariness woven through the extraordinary parts is worth infinitely more than loving a beautiful, unreachable idea that never quite gets tested against reality. I want to leave you with one final thought before I go, because I think it matters beyond just this one connection. There's a particular kind of loneliness that comes from being loved only for an image, an achievement, a performance, a version of yourself you feel you have to keep maintaining in order to keep the affection coming. That loneliness exists even inside relationships that look from outside completely happy, because the person underneath the admired image never quite gets to relax, never quite gets to stop managing the impression. That isn't what these cards are describing for you. What's being built here has room in it for you to eventually stop performing entirely, to simply exist, ordinary and complete, and discover that the feeling holds anyway. That's the actual gift underneath all of this, more valuable than the initial glow, however wonderful the glow currently feels. Let them fall for all of you. Not just the version that currently looks like it came from heaven. I'll see you at the next one.